Marika, how are you?
How are you?
I'm good. Paul, how are you? Greg?
Excellent.
Yeah. Rolf? Very nice. So I guess none of the regular crew is going to be in the Forex tomorrow, huh? Is anybody from here going to history of FX or history of money for tomorrow?
History of money, yes.
Tomorrow.
Yes, yes. What time? History of money. 7, right?
Yes.
Great.
Oh, I meant to send you something. Zach.
Yeah.
I'll send it. I'll just remember.
I know, John, if you want to start, there's 9 people. You can go ahead if you want. Today's presentation is in Kursk. We're continuing through the World War II theme, and Kursk is one of the most important, it's one of the important battles on the Eastern Front. So without further ado, I'll give it to John.
You know, Zach, it's 7 o'clock on the nose, so why don't you give it a few minutes? There are people coming.
Yeah,
it's
just joined.
People always trail in, but I'm not sharing it, so how does it get displayed?
Hold on, go ahead. Go share screen and grab it.
Okay, I'm sharing.
Grab this.
Hello, everyone.
Is it on the desktop?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah,
What does it say when you share it?
share with people in groups, add sharing restrictions.
No, that's not it. So if you click on share screen
It's in the bottom.
on the bottom,
Okay,
it
let
should
me
give
get
you
rid of
different
this.
screens. It should give you desktop. It should give you where is your PowerPoint presentation, and you click on that one.
Okay, it's on the bottom, share screen,
Yeah,
right
There should
bottom.
be a green button.
green button. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not looking at Zoom.
Oh,
I got it.
Yeah, you have to move your cursor onto the bottom of the Zoom gallery.
Yeah, I know. I just get confused at my age.
you've got to hover as the
So
term.
I'm seeing my briefing. I just click on that,
Yes.
double click, single click didn't do anything.
Give it
2 clicks. There you
Here
go.
we go.
You can see
We're
it? Okay,
starting.
good,
Yeah.
excellent.
We can see it.
Now I can see it.
Okay, I hit present.
All right.
So I
So
should,
while we have a little bit of time, we have a new person, Maximiliano. Introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
Hello, I'm Maximiliano. I'm from South America, from Chile, and I'm learning Russian. So I
Ooh.
find this presentation very
Говорите
interesting.
по-русски, говорите по-русски.
Да, я говорю по-русски, но немного.
Немного, но хорошо. Okay, that's a good presentation to be at. We're gonna have a lot of people speaking a lot of Russian terms. But
Great.
this is in English, though. But we would, there would be. At least you'll hear a lot of Russian names,
Yeah,
so-
yeah, I noticed that.
all right. How's everything in Chile? Things are-
Great. Here is summer now, and it's very hot. All
oh,
great, and the quarantine is every time better. We are getting along with this.
Do you live in Chile or you live here in the States?
No, I live in Chile, in South America,
What city?
in Santiago is the capital.
Is there what's the COVID crisis like there?
What's the what? Sorry.
What is the effect of the pandemic there?
Oh, horrible. Like in all the world, is the economy is falling apart, and a lot of people is run out of money. It's very hard, actually.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and where are you from?
We're all New York. Well, most of us.
Oh, New York.
oh, I'm not. I'm in Virginia.
John is in Virginia, but John used to live in New York, right?
Oh yeah, I went to school there. So,
Yeah,
Back in-
I had to find something in New York because it's very hard to find something like this in my country. So I had to change it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is, I hope you like it. Tomorrow we also have a presentation on history of money. If you're interested, check that one out. And we're also
Yeah,
Sunday, Pearl Harbor. So, if you really want to learn about America, I guess.
yeah. You will also have a presentation about why Hitler,
Yeah,
something
that's
about Russia.
next week. Yeah. Where
Yeah,
did Hitler go wrong in Russian campaign? Yeah.
yeah. I already signed up for that.
All right. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, we'll have Russian subtitles. Can you read Cyrillics? Cyrillics?
Yeah,
you-
I can. I have
do you-
been learning for 6 months, so I can listen a little, I can speak a little, and I do well too with the reading.
Very
Why are
nice.
you learning Russian? It's
I want
intellectual
to.
interest?
No, I want to move to St. Petersburg. And also I have friends here who are Russian, so it's nice to speak with them in their native language.
Very nice. Very commending it. It's one of the most difficult languages, I guess, to learn because
But one of the most beautiful too. I love how it sounds.
I don't know. People said when they hear me speaking Russian, to them I sound like weird, like zhishki, pshishki, vushki, vashki. It's like, what is this?
Well, to a naive English speaker, it sounds like you're speaking while eating chocolate. It's all that palatalization. Yeah.
Yeah, it's happened to me too.
Yeah, it's all right. We have a guy here, Greg. He actually runs a Russian literature club. So
Yeah, if you're
Oh, right.
interested, it's called NYC Russian Novels, and actually the next one is going to be at Moscow to the End of the Line by Yerofeyev. I don't know, Zach, if you haven't read it, you got to read it because I'm reading it right now. It's hilarious. It's I wonder how it's translated but there are so many references there that I'm not sure they will play out the same way. But who knows? But it's really funny. It's amazing. But it's really so. Zach, have you read it? By the way,
what? No, which one?
the Moscow to the End of Line. It's called Moskva Petushki.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah,
You read it?
yeah, but a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it very much. It's so
Could, could you please write it down the number so I can look at it later and try to read it?
It's if you go, are you
Yeah, I'll
connected to
write
the
in the chat.
meetups?
I'll
Are you
write
connected to meetups? I can, yeah, I'll give you because it's right there. You will, if you join the group, you could go and
Okay.
see the name of the book and the time. We're meeting in 3 weeks, so you have plenty of time to read it. It's not a big book.
Oh, yeah, great. What's the name of the group again?
It's called NYC Russian Novels. I'll post the
Oh, yeah.
link on the chat. Let me see.
If you can post
Yeah,
group on the chat, people might be interested in Russian literature group as well.
I will definitely join it. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, Greg is an interesting guy.
Greg,
Yeah.
when you mentioned it's hilarious, why is it funny book or what?
It's very funny. I don't know if it's amazingly funny to me. I mean, I laugh out loud, and I really mean it. Sometimes can't even hold myself. But I don't know. It's a very specific Russian humor, so it's
Okay.
sometimes dark humor. So I cannot guarantee you're gonna like it. It's also sometimes a little bit crude, but it's also intellectual and sometimes sexist, but in a very absurd way. I mean, so it's very interesting. Let me just post this. group.
Maximilian, how are you with Russian humor? You like it or?
Well, not so much because I don't like that sexist and cruel things. But sometimes they're pretty fine. Yeah.
Greg, I will ask you later. There is a Russian woman, is a writer. She's kind of modern, and she wrote like 2 or 3 books. I lost her name, and she's very, very funny. She wrote about the nuclear thing. I mean, she's really, really very good. But
You're
I
talking
lost
about Svetlana Alexievich?
what did she wrote?
Svetlana Alexievich, who the one who won the Nobel Prize?
No, she didn't want well, I ask you later because I would love to get her name.
All right, without further ado, John, why don't you start? Sorry, guys.
Yeah, well, this one is on the Battle of Kursk. Zach said it was, our great leader, Zach said it was one of the great battles. I think you could make a strong case that it was the battle of World War II, more so than Stalingrad, and we can discuss that down the road. I should say I just prepared a few slides in the spirit of, this is supposed to be a Q&A session, more of a discussion rather than a lecture. So with that, I will talk to you, since the Battle of Kursk came after a couple of years of war between the Nazis and the Soviets. I'll give you a little bit of the background. Here you can see that Stalingrad occurred it was encircled by December 12th, 1942 by the Germans, and the Sixth Army of Germany, 300,000 men, were trapped in Stalingrad. Eventually, they surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, and we all know the horrible story. You can see here's Stalingrad. It's down in the southwest. The Soviets succeeded in encircling the city. You can see that. Oops, have to use my pointer. You can't see that, can you? Oops.
We can see your pointer.
This is Stalingrad. These are I couldn't find very good maps on this conflict. This map only has the Soviet movements. It doesn't have the German ones. And I looked pretty hard on the internet, but I'll try to make up for it. But here's the encirclement of Stalingrad, which sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. And all those 300,000 men were marched off into captivity, and only a few thousand ever came back. They were not treated well. It was revenge for how the Germans had treated Soviets. The yellow portion of the map represents the encirclement. This was called Operation Uranus on the Soviet side. It was finished by December 12th. The surrender was on February 2nd, 1943. This was the first major defeat for the Germans. It was a major world propaganda defeat. Everyone in the world was watching this because the Germans had not been successfully challenged before this. The beige portion, the Soviets were really, once they had conquered Stalingrad, defended it from the Germans, I should say, the beige portion here represents Soviet counter advances. Oh, excuse me. And these finished up by February 18th, 1943. The Soviets had pushed the Germans back. Army Group South was the German formation they were fighting against. And you can see here they got all the way to Kursk, which was a city about 280 miles south of Moscow. Where's Moscow? There. Looks like it's farther away, but I think it's 280 miles. And then the green portion is the Soviets managed to reach a little bit beyond Kursk by March 1943. And this is where the famous Kursk salient came into existence. And we'll talk about that in some, well, this is not a lecture, it's just trying to set the scene for our discussion. I should say at the same time in late 42 and early 43, lots of other things were going on. This is the famous Operation Mars, which, oops, I'm having trouble here. Operation Mars, where General Zhukov was trying to push the Germans away from Moscow, and it was a miserable failure, the opposite of Kursk, which was a huge success for the Soviets. Next step here, in the context of their, I'm backing up a bit, in the context of their move forward to the northwest, the Soviets had extended themselves quite a bit. Their flanks were exposed here. And what happened is that, this is not a very good image, but it's the only one I could really find. It gave an opportunity to the Germans, the Army Group South under Erich von Manstein, the great German general. He launched a counterattack from the south going straight north here. You have to sort of knit these two maps together. The attack started here from the south, down in the Dnieper area, where the Germans already were, and it was launched directly north, and they managed to reconquer Belgorod, if that's the proper pronunciation. I know no Russian, so if anybody wants to jump in and correct my pronunciation, please do. And so they managed to reconquer that, and that's actually what created the salient. Because if you go ahead here, I'm skipping over a slide.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
So this part is particularly interesting because Manstein, for a while, was the only German general that could get permission from Hitler to retreat.
Correct.
And
I was reading that. He
was able to keep that by counterattacking successfully after he retreated. You know, so it lasted for a little while, but not forever. Ultimately, Hitler got tired of it. Manstein couldn't deliver the victories.
Yeah, well, Manstein was incredibly successful. Hitler awarded special awards to the units that participated in this particular assault. The main strategic success, they managed to capture Kharkov, which was a major center. But from a strategic viewpoint, what it succeeded in was created the salient, because the Germans managed to push up here. And so what you had here, this was a result of the Soviets advancing. They had had a pretty smooth line going south, but Manstein managed to push it up. And the problem with salients, and it happened to the Americans in the Battle of the Bulge. I have a jumpy computer here. In the Battle of the Bulge, you know, in 44, the Americans had a similar bulge, and the problem with salients, you can get attacked from multiple directions. Here are the Soviets, here are the Germans, if I want to say the obvious. And you don't know which way to point the guns, let me put it that way. So it's a real threat, and the Soviets couldn't do much about it because Manstein had been so successful. So here you have the Ottawa battle. Basically, it's Army Group, as I'm sure most of you know, you have the Germans were divided into Army Group North, which was up around Leningrad. You had Army Group Center, which was focused in the middle, and Army Group South, which was aimed at the Southwest, Stalingrad, the Caucasus, and what have you. So basically, it was Army Group Center, Army Group South versus the Central Front. Now, front in the Soviet Union was an army group. It was a collection of armies. These are huge formations, hundreds of thousands of men. So
sorry, you're talking, this is the winter of 42, right?
No, this is spring of 43.
So this is much later.
Yeah, Stalingrad was enveloped by the Soviets in December of 42. It surrendered in early February 43. This is the next month, because this was a result of Soviet counterattacks after Stalingrad. So, but this is the Central Front. These are the major Soviet fronts included in the Kursk battle. The Central Front, commanded by Rokossovsky, and these were all really famous Soviet generals. And this was the Voronezh Front, commanded by Vatutin. And there was a third, a very important front, which I couldn't find a map which included it. It was the Steppe Front, which was off here to the east, and it formed the major set of reserve forces that the Soviets used for their counteroffensives. It was the most important front in the war. At this point, Hitler had run out of reserves. So everything in the front lines was what the Germans had. So that was one of the reasons the Germans ended up in such a bad way. Oh, this is annoying. Now, let me go forward. Now, the two major Soviet counterattacks, here we are back to the salient, came down from here, and they had the force to do it, came down from here, and they came up from here to attack. The Germans were already invading the salient. You can see their lines here. Let me go forward a bit. Oh, I want to go back here. This is the easiest way to look at it because it's highly schematic. Here you have Kursk. Here you have the basic numbers and the forces available. The Germans had 2,700 tanks, 900,000 infantry. Russians had 3,306 tanks and 1,337,000 infantry. So this was a huge, huge force by World War II standards. If you look at this cutout, this is the Germans invading here, the red lines. What they're trying to do in the salient is to encircle Kursk and capture. There were many hundreds of thousands of German troops in the salient, and one of the main features was just to capture these troops for slave labor back in Germany. That was a stated goal of Hitler. It seems quite primitive, but that's how the man thought. These blue lines are the later Soviet counterattacks. Okay, to give you a quick summary, and then it'll be very quick, we can move over into a discussion. This Battle of Kursk was the battle where the Soviets stopped the German blitzkrieg for the first time, and I'll show you how they did it. And they began a counteroffensive. It was the first time the Soviets could mount a counteroffensive against a German attack in good weather. In the past, they had only been able to do it in the wintertime, but the Germans owned the summer, basically. Now, this happened due to natural developments. It was near the city of Kursk, and it was during July and August 1943. The battle began with the launch of the German offensive called Operation Citadel, Operation Citadella, and on July 5th, 1943, it had the objective, as I showed you, of pinching off the Kursk salient. They attacked at the base from the north and from the south simultaneously. And they assembled probably the largest armored force in history to do it. Now, what happened is the German offensive did fine on the south, but it stalled in the north. The Soviets were successful in stopping them. And this is the first time the Soviets had done this, actually. Now, the Soviets, a week later, July 12th, the Soviets commenced what they called, I don't know the Russian for it, the Kursk Strategic Offensive Operation. And this launched Operation Kutuzov, which is the name of the famous Napoleonic era general, against the rear of the German forces on the northern side. Let me go forward and show that to you. This is Operation Kutuzov. It shows the Bryansk front here. This is this was to the north of Kursk. And again, this is a huge military formation attacking the flanks of Army Group Center as they were pushing their units into the salient. You see here, these forces here are the ones going in to the salient. Now now this also led to the on the southern side, and I don't have a very good graphic here. I have to apologize. This was the only one I could find. But on the southern side, they also launched a simultaneous counterattack the same day, July 12th. And this led to the most famous tank battle of the war at Prokhorovka. So this began on August 3rd, and it was against the German forces on the southern side of the salient. The whole goal of this was to weaken the Germans hoped to weaken the Soviet offensive potential for the summer of 1933. They wanted to cut off the forces that were inside the salient. And Hitler, after Stalingrad, Hitler became very worried that he was losing his prestige, that he had had a bad loss, and his allies in particular would conclude that there was no way that Germany could win. And so the allies would, like Hungary and Italy, Romania, would start to make their separate deals with the other side. One of the problems with Citadel is one of the most telegraphed battles in history. The Soviets, the Stavka, the Soviets general staff knew it was coming in the spring. They knew it was coming way ahead of time. One of the reasons was that it was just such an obvious target. You have this big bulge sticking out there that's really vulnerable to attack. They also had strong British intelligence that it was coming.
It was
what happened
sorry, John, just one thing. It was actually a spy ring in Switzerland, Lucille, right? That was called.
My source mentioned a British source named Tunney. There may have been, usually there are multiple ones here. These are big events.
The one from Switzerland that gave it away. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was called the Red Orchestra.
Orchestra.
It's the same. It's the same. They were, I think they were from Switzerland, but they were coming actually.
Okay, well, the thing is, both sides knew this was going to happen months ahead of time. The Germans did not achieve the surprise they had in Barbarossa, the original invasion, Operation Blau, the push towards the southwest. Now, the Germans decided, Hitler was very worried that German forces were very weak. They had lost a lot of people, the whole army at Stalingrad, a loss of equipment. Hitler was obsessed with advanced weapons. So the best tanks in the world, the Panther and the Tiger tanks, were just coming into production. So he wanted to delay the assault a few months. They could have attacked in March, just a couple of months after Stalingrad was lost. But they waited till July, and the goal was to build up their forces. Now, what happened here is that the Red Army knew this was going on, and it gave them time to construct a series of deep defensive belts. I don't have an image of that, and to establish a large reserve force behind the lines for counteroffensives. I mentioned that. That's the step front. Now, what happened here, there's also a bigger picture than what's going on in the Soviet Union. Hitler was also worried the week that the Kursk battle began was when the Allied invasion of Sicily happened. It was the same week. So troops that were training in France, German troops that were training in France that had been intended to go to the Eastern War, they had to be diverted to handle the Allied threat in the Mediterranean. Rather than use them as a strategic reserve for the Eastern Front, Hitler canceled the offensive at Kursk after only a week. I mean, I believe it was July 12th. And the reason for this was he wanted to divert those forces to Italy. Now, basically, this is a thumbnail sketch. This is the longest I'll be talking, then I'll shut up. But what this meant is that basically at Kursk, the Soviet Red Army gained the strategic initiative for the remainder of the war. As I said, the Battle of Kursk was the first time in the Second World War that a German strategic blitzkrieg offensive was halted before it could break through enemy defenses and penetrate to the strategic depths. That means really getting into important enemy real estate, factories and what have you. Now, you can make the strong argument from this. Stalingrad may be the most famous battle, but it could be seen as a prelude to Kursk, where this is where the Red Army gained the initiative and never lost it. Germany had lost its reserves. They had nobody else to throw into the battle. In reality, Hitler had to face a situation where he could either fight the Allies with the reserves, or he could use the reserves to fight the Russians. I mean the Western allies. with reserves. He didn't have the resources to do both. And this is where the fate of Germany was sealed at Kursk. And what happened, as I said, there were lots of other things going on. Given the imbalance of forces, the Soviets were becoming quite dominant, both in personnel and equipment. It was, the Soviets were able to apply pressure along the entire front, and all Germany could do is defend. It no longer had the resources to mount any kind of major offensive, and they didn't after this time. Now that's the end of me. I just put up some issues here.
I had a general
Yes.
question. The Germans were taking pictures of the area before. I mean, I can't understand how they couldn't see all the Russians preparing the defense. I mean, the defense was extensive. I mean, all the trenches, how they...
Well, surprisingly, the Germans, 4 German generals from Kursk, including Manstein, wrote memoirs after the war, and the Germans did not have accurate, even any kind of intelligence as to the reserves that were available to the Russians. They didn't know about the steppe front. It's surprising, but I've been reading the leading American historian of the Eastern War, David Glantz, and he makes that claim. I see no reason to dispute it. It only became clear after the war that the Soviets had such enormous an enormous advantage. It's quite surprising.
I mean, the Germans, they thought that the army was very, the Russians were subhuman and they were stupid and they didn't know anything. But that, I mean, that was one thing.
Well,
but the Russians had been preparing and digging trenches and working there, and the Germans were taking pictures. And how do they?
It didn't sink in. Stereotypes are hard to overcome in yourself.
I disagree. I really disagree. I think the German army found out right away that the Russian soldiers were much, much tougher than anything they had ever faced. And Russians were always learning extremely quickly about how to protect themselves and so forth. So by time you get to this point, the Soviets are really tactically and operationally very, very good.
But that's not what the Germans thought.
The Germans, no, the Germans, well, what the Germans may say through the mouthpiece of the propaganda ministry versus what was the knowledge of the troops who were fighting the Russians are two completely different things.
So how do they
The Germans regarded the Russian troops as in some cases being superhuman.
But Glantz says it's true. The German opinion of Russian capabilities improved quite a bit from 41 to 43, and we're in 43. But the Germans did not have a clear picture of total Russian strength, according to Glantz.
Right, but what I'm saying is that there was no lack of respect by the Germans for their Soviet opponents at that point. They knew that they were in for, with people who knew what they were doing, and they may or may not get out alive. So
they were defeated.
This idea of, oh, these guys are nothing, let's just blow them away.
No, but that was
I completely agree.
I mean,
I would describe what happened as kind of like this. I think big thing. The Germans always had this notion that if they could just focus enough of their force and have it fully supplied in a concentrated way, that nothing could stop them, and they go through it like a knife, like butter.
Yeah,
and it was like that through almost all of 1941, right? And then, okay, so we know that they ran out of steam on that. And meanwhile, the Russians were getting better. They had lost a lot of their inexperienced people, and they were learning lessons. And then we get 1942, and the Germans once again tried to take the offensive, but it's the same army that they were fighting with before, right? The Russians are kind of restoring themselves. The Germans are not restoring themselves at the rate that the Russians are. And when they get to Stalingrad, the point of how overextended they are becomes apparent to everybody, right? That this was now unsustainable. And so Stalingrad pushes them back, and, they have these skirmishes, so Kharkov changes hands a few times, but when they pause, the Germans now are trying to take the opportunity to rebuild their army. And they had taken Guderian and basically given him the assignment of rebuilding the tank army. And he had actually done that. They had a whole new thing.
And the Germans have they won one of the battles after Leningrad. I mean, after Stalingrad, they won. I don't remember which town. So it was like 2 months after. They thought that they were defeated, and then the tide turned around. But do you know how is it possible that they can prepare all the trenches? They did like 5.
Well, first of all, the Russians were universally considered the masters of camouflage. Right, that was
the Mashkarovka, that was a large part of it.
Acknowledged by all armies. That
I will say, at the leadership level, Stavka, originally Stalin wanted to have an offensive campaign at Kursk, and he was talked into doing a combined defensive and offensive campaign. So they came up with the idea of defense in depth, which was new to them actually, but they also positioned very strong reserves behind the front to launch a counteroffensive quickly. After the German punch, the German force had been stopped. So that was something new for them. It was quite sophisticated. And by 43, they had no idea of combined weapons operations, integrated combat operations. And by 43, they had gotten pretty good at it. So
yeah, they had a good doctrine, and it was different from Blitzkrieg, but it was very effective.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one detail, because we were talking about the Kharkov, and during the offensive of 1941, the Russians managed to relocate the whole plant, and Kharkov had a very big plant that produced vehicles that was refurbished into producing tanks, the T-34. It was relocated to the Ural Mountains. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was one of the organizers of that relocation. And that was one of the reasons that by the time that Kursk came about, the Russians managed to produce such a mass production of the tanks. The Kursk had the largest tank battle ever in history, on both sides.
Yeah.
Because that played a major role. So the Russian tanks, maybe somebody can talk a little bit more to the technical details, but my general understanding that they were lighter tanks. They may not have been one-to-one equal to the Tigers and the Panthers, but they were more maneuverable, and they had advantage in numbers. For sure, they had more tanks, almost double the amount that Germans had.
I saw a quotation. Even at Kursk, the Soviets were not capable of killing a Tiger tank, except if a rifleman managed to get a shot in through the visor and kill the driver. They just could not take them out. They were overwhelmed by much greater numbers of weaker tanks.
Take them out from the side. They couldn't take them out frontally, but they could take them out from the side. The side armor is much thinner. And so the idea of the defense were to create killing zones in which this is what the Russians created. They created killing zones which were, that would funnel the Germans through it, and then they would have flank shots at the German armor and be able to stop it. And when they got really close, infantrymen could take out Tiger tanks. If they were able and brave enough, and essentially willing to die, you weren't going to get out of that alive.
Yeah, which a great many of them were.
That's correct. The Soviets took huge losses in this battle, huge
That's
losses
the
in men and
that's the
material.
paradox of the war. It's estimated that the Soviets lost 4 to 5 people for every German killed, but it was a great victory for the Soviets because they had pretty much inexhaustible supplies of manpower. I mean, in a way, it's too bad for them, but the country did win as a result. And their leaders like Stalin and Zhukov were utterly indifferent to human suffering. So, but with the Nazis,
Germans, like
with
the
the
Germans too, right? I don't think the Germans were very caring about the suffering.
no, the Germans were
Suffering
fools.
of others, they were indifferent, but not that they took care of their soldiers.
Excuse me, I didn't
The
quite.
Germans took care of their soldiers. They were not indifferent to suffering of
Correct. The
others.
Germans
The Russians indifferent to suffering of their own soldiers.
I know it's quite striking. Germans have a very bad reputation, but the relations between at the small unit level, the officer was generally a father figure. They would actually socialize in the German army, and they were together for the duration of the war. One of the mistakes the American military made is that they would rotate people in. Officers would go in for a year and then they would move to another unit. This was a big problem in Vietnam. The Germans in World War II, the officers were stuck with their troops for the entire war, which produced an incredible amount of bonding between them. It made them so effective. They were just done in by their industrial capacity was weaker than the Allied powers. I mean, the Allied powers possessed 3/4 of the world's industrial capacity. Germany was a very small power by comparison. They just could not produce the materiel or the population necessary to win. I mean, it was, it kind of didn't matter what they did.
They did have, some, really effective ideas, but you're absolutely right that it just wasn't enough to overcome what they were up against. But the thing that you point out, there's a book by Martin van Creveld, who is a historian, military historian, moved to Israel, became an Israeli citizen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of him, yes.
And his study was basically asking the question of, is it true that the German troops were more effective than the other nationalities, and if so, why? And the answer that it came up with was yes, absolutely. If you measure unit cohesion, in other words, the ability of the unit to maintain military effectiveness, the Germans were superior. And the reason that, he asked, well, was there something intrinsic about the German character or German culture or something like that? He said, no. It was about the way that the Germans organized their recruitment, and that, in other words, that as you said, the Germans were organized kind of geographically by kind of a province. So it's not small enough so that if people took a lot of casualties, that a whole village would be dead. It was like a state, and that would be an army which would remain in contact with the army at the front and be continuing to train people and send them to the front. When casualties occurred at the front, they would come back to the center, and as they would recover, they would train new troops, and then they would lead them back to the front. Right? So this created a unique type of psychological bonding in the Wehrmacht that was not duplicated in any other place. Now, the Japanese were an exception because of the overpowering nature of their ideology.
Yeah, it was the Japanese were quite amazing, whole large units committing suicide together. I mean, it was kind of psychotic, but that's the way they were. The Germans, it was a nasty totalitarian system, but they were remarkably good at building a great army. I seem to remember Martin Krebel said the Wehrmacht was the best army ever. They lost because of industrial incapacity.
They had this huge inheritance of the Prussian general staff, and the Prussian general staff were really intellectual innovators. So one of their biggest things was they came up with this thing called mission orders. So instead of a higher headquarters telling their subsidiary units, go here, do this, do that, they would instead say, you have the following mission. And then it was up to the group, the unit, to figure out how to execute the mission as was best suited to the terrain on the spot.
That is
And
true.
they were encouraged to take initiative. So, you know, in quite the opposite of the image of these robotic Nazi soldiers following orders, they were trained exactly the opposite way, to take initiative when they were not receiving orders from higher command.
Okay, so the only thing I would suggest, though, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but there is only so much manpower you have, and this works well in 41, 42, 43. By 44, they're hurting because the best guys have already gone to the front, and now you're taking the ones.
I agree with you 100%. 100%.
By the end, they were down to children. I mean, it was just a lack of, they
They
were
had
not
this idea of qualitative superiority, and they just didn't, they didn't really understand that the resistance would not be overcome in the initial, you know, wave of the superiority, and then they had no ability to hang on for the long term.
I agree 100%. Is they were so successful in the first few years with blitzkrieg techniques, as they just, you know, cut through numerically vastly superior forces, and they did it with you know, better technology, better coordination of forces, just better élan. I mean, yes.
After the First World War, after Germany lost the First World War, I thought that they were not allowed to have an army. So the army, when did they start building an army?
Well, in the 20s, the Germans started cheating on the Versailles Treaty, is my understanding. And what's funny about World War II is the Germans and the Soviets were both pariah states, and in the 20s, they started cooperating on military maneuvers to bolster each other. When Hitler got to power, he just built up the army in defiance of Versailles.
Also, part of it is that the Germans were left allowed to have 100,000 troops in their army. And that what the Germans did was that they kept the absolute best of the Imperial Army. And so they kept a lot of the non-commissioned officers and lower officers. And that became the core of what later became the Wehrmacht. And like was said, that they cheated almost immediately with testing cars like tanks and airplanes, and a lot of that was done in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, just one comment, you know, not about Wehrmacht, warriors, but prior to Stalingrad, what was interesting is Stalin recognized that there was commissars that were basically, you know, trying to interrupt the whole, army movement, or there was a lot of, good decisions were made, but a lot of the generals, Russian generals, were afraid to make decisions because there was commissars, which was this ideology, communist ideology, people that were instilled in each unit that were preventing from people making the great decisions. And he stopped that. He said, you know what, I have to let my generals do their job,
Yeah, Stalin engaged in some stupid offensive operations. He insisted on happening even before the army was ready. I think after the Battle of Moscow, he wanted to counterattack immediately. But the difference between Stalin and Hitler is Stalin was a realist and could subordinate his ego. He listened pretty consistently to his military experts during the war.
I think in the 30s, there was the purge in Russia. Yeah. So the army, I'm sure that the best people were lost there.
Well, it's interesting is that one of the interesting demographic, I put it on the slide somewhere, demographic facts about Kursk is that the average age of the German senior commanders was 20 years older than the Soviet commanders. And I wonder how much, so your average Soviet commander was 40 and the German equivalent was 60. Did that play a role in the amount of energy that went into the battle? And because it's true, Stalin purged all the senior commanders and he opened up great career opportunities for their juniors.
Yeah,
it may have played a part
Zhukov
in...
was in Gulag. Zhukov was in Gulag.
Yeah, Yes,
Well,
he was.
Rokossovsky was purged as
Yeah,
well.
Rokossovsky
many of them, but he did return some of them, you know, without
Rokossovsky
Zhukov.
was a Pole, so he was
Exactly,
always
but he
distrusted.
can, but anybody who was against him will be out. So.
Oh, no, you don't have to be against him to be out. You could be totally for him. Most of them were entirely for him, and
Oh,
they
I
were
always,
out anyway. He was
it's a
paranoid.
lesson to all dictators. Hitler ended up committing suicide because he was loyal. He didn't execute his generals and a lot of other people. The political leadership in Nazi Germany was quite stable. Stalin, on the other hand, killed tons of people and he died a natural death, had a stroke. So if you're going to be a dictator, follow Stalin. Because Hitler, if you look at the Nazi leadership, the people with him at the beginning were the people with him at the end. I mean,
No, don't forget, he eliminated some people too. Rommel is a Hitler,
yeah, but it was
Here's a
in
few.
the hundreds. The
But
Night of the
Goebbels
Long
was
Knives
with
was in
him
the
from the
hundreds. Stalin's
beginning.
victims were in the millions.
Goebbels was with him from the beginning. Goering was with him from the beginning.
And Himmler
Lots
was
of
in
the
this.
others were with him from the beginning, but Stalin actually killed anybody that actually had personal association with Lenin. Right?
Yeah,
The
you
whole
see.
circle of the Bolshevik Party was dead.
Yeah,
or
you see
personal
these.
association with him before revolution. He killed all of those people who knew
Yeah,
him
oh,
before, who could, remember being just buddies. And
He
no, it's
killed
rather
all
funny. You
Lenin's,
see these photos
Central
of
Committee.
Stalin from the 20s and early 30s when he's with all the old Bolsheviks and they're attending a funeral or something. And the writer invariably says that Stalin executed everybody in that photo.
Yeah, he did have two friends though. Greg would know. One of them is Badeni, and I believe was the other one. What's this other? Timoshenko.
Timoshenko, yeah, there
He
was
was he
Timoshenko. I
had
don't know.
cronies who were safe.
Yeah,
You're right.
but Johnny wanted to fight tanks with cavalry. He thought that in World War II, the cavalry was the most effective way of fighting this war.
And there was another one, Jewish one, Kaganovich. It was most important one.
Was
yeah. So but Johnny was not really.
But those guys
very
really
effective.
didn't survive the first campaign. If you were just that totally incompetent, that you didn't stay in, you were not still a ranking officer by the time the winter was over.
Yeah,
No, if he
Stalin-
liked you, because Badeni did stay, and I thought Timoshenko stayed too. I might be wrong on that.
I don't think he got command responsibility.
That's right.
No, he took him out of that, but he didn't kill him.
They moved him sideways. I'm just saying that he was no longer a factor.
No, Stalin could recognize talent and respect it. He always kept his generals. There was the famous for the Battle of Berlin. He was playing off Rokossovsky or Konev against Zhukov, and as to who could get there first. And he was not kind or respectful about it at all. And when Zhukov got stuck on the Salo Heights, 100 miles from Berlin, Stalin gave him a very difficult time as to why he wasn't moving faster, even though Zhukov was responsible for winning the war. But he could recognize talent, and
right, but
he didn't have great careers.
After the war, Stalin isolated Zhukov.
Yeah.
Not Rokossovsky. Rokossovsky became the defense minister. Not right away, but later on. So he still stayed. But Zhukov was real talent. He kind of isolated him. He became nobody. That's why he wrote the memoirs. I read his memoirs. Pretty interesting.
And we should say that his plan for Kursk was absolutely brilliant. Stalin's strategic plan for conducting the defense and the counteroffensive, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I remember.
Followed on absolutely brilliant offensive at Stalingrad. Yeah. So he was doing it one time after the next, getting better each time.
Okay, but John did say initially Stalin wanted to attack. Okay, so it wasn't his brilliance. He listened to his commanders.
Yeah, there was a long debate in the Stavka about how to handle it, and he listened to the professionals. Because Stalin did tend to be overly aggressive.
Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he wanted to have an attack exactly on some, let's say, holiday. Something like October Revolution holiday. He wanted to have a success, and even the army was unprepared. they had to attack. They lost a lot of people as a result of it. He just did sometimes this stuff that is, just comes to in mind because he felt that politically he wanted to get political capital out of it, and it cost thousands of lives.
Right, but if you compare him to Hitler, Hitler was much more devastating to the command of the German army than Stalin was to the Russian army. Right?
Okay.
Hitler really.
Oh, in terms of effect, oh, yes. Except David Glantz gives Hitler his due. Hitler usually gets blamed for, telling the Wehrmacht, you shall not take one step back ever. And that was ridiculous. But Glantz says sometimes Hitler was right. At the Battle of Moscow in 41, it was the generals who wanted to retreat. Hitler said, just stay there.
See, the problem was he was right in 1941, and he thought that was the way to do it for the rest of the war.
Yeah.
That's right.
There he became wrong. But in 1941, he was right.
So Hitler did have some good insights on a military basis.
But I'm saying that what happened in 1942 is Hitler basically took over, personally operational planning. Stalin never did anything like that.
No, he was
right. So Hitler would be standing there with the map and ordering the army groups around.
Well, I think Stalin wanted to keep his fingerprints off any specific decisions of a military nature. He was always very canny. Hitler would get right in the middle and take the blame. Because what's amazing is how popular Stalin lost. Hitler lost popular support. They didn't do any polls in Germany, of course, but it's pretty clear the people were very unhappy with him after they started losing.
That's
but
the
Stalin's popularity, and today it's even, from what I read, it's even going up in Russia. Lots of people like him.
Oh, that's the nostalgia of the good old Soviet time.
Yeah, it's
superpower, and that's something that he's built. That's not. I don't think he's very popular with the young people. I mean, like some old people.
Yeah, they might. I don't know Russia very well, actually.
Greg,
I saw in doing a little bit of research for this talk. I came across last year. There was a British reporter who found some aerial photographs of the Kursk of the I forget the Prokhorovka battlefield.
Yeah.
The main battle of the war, and it created great upset in the Kremlin and elsewhere, and in the Duma, because this historian said that in the photographs, for every single German Tiger Panther tank destroyed, there were 10 T-34s destroyed. So the Soviet claims of a great victory here were just totally bogus, and he was getting death threats, and I think a member of the Duma called for his prosecution, which was, I don't know who to believe, but it was the Soviet propaganda machine that turned. It's rather odd they turned that battle into a great success when it may not have been, but the overall battle was a huge success. I mean, it seems.
And the T-34 thing, they weren't all T-34s. The Russians had a large number, the Soviets had a large number of T-70s, which are basically light tanks. So that Fifth Guards tank charge, that's the basis of Prokhorovka, half those tanks are not T-34s. The Germans tore them up.
Anyway, I just put it out there. Was a historian publishing in 2019. It's still a very touchy area for the Soviets.
So I mean, that southern pincer was where all the SS was.
Yes.
That was the SS Panzer Army. So that was kind of like the prototypical confrontation, of the whole war. And these guys were making much better progress than they were making in the north. But it was not like a knife like butter, and they kept on having to, they were pushing further to the east because there was too much resistance as they were trying to get north. And ultimately, this wave of, as you say, yes, they were not all T-34s, but the way they kept coming, once you got them, they came actually intermixed. The forces actually became intermixed. They had, interpenetrated at that point. So it was just a wild free-for-all. And just the fact that the Germans were stopped by that. You know, the Germans withdrew from the battlefield, and then from after that, they never had the wherewithal to launch anything like that again. And, you know, then Hitler pulls Das Reich out of the line to send them to Italy. And it becomes obvious, you know, what a crazy gamble this was. You know, he couldn't even get through with everything, and now he's pulling things away because he's being attacked from the West.
Yeah, that was an issue. I didn't mention the situation in the air, but the Germans lost air superiority in 43 because Hitler had to defend the Reich from bombing and also pull troops to the Mediterranean, pull aircraft and their pilots to the Mediterranean. So the Germans lost a huge, basically in terms of defending the Reich, it sounds like Hitler decided that the defending against the West was more important in many ways.
Yeah, but he sort of had to do that because if his civilian population is completely wiped out, he has no one to support him. You know, so it wasn't just the air, which is important, but 88 millimeter guns, they're not going to the Eastern Front because they're needed for anti-aircraft defense.
Correct.
But yet they thought that they gave up mostly to the West, not to the Russians. They knew there'd be no mercy from Russians. So after a while, they kind of would welcome more of the West advances than Russians. But,
John, I have a question. So after you know, Stalingrad, you know, you would say decisive, you know, German defeat, we have Kharkov. Why did, one second, sorry.
by the way, just the
Why
way
did,
they,
oh,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
okay. No, you go ahead. I thought to fill the.
So they have Kharkov, right? Kharkov, now we have Germans winning in that battle. How much of the confidence that it gave them that they can execute a Kursk in the manner that they did? I mean, we're talking about initially the Luftwaffe was doing a number of, you know, I mean, wonderful job in there, and, you know, did destroy a lot of T-34 tanks and other tanks. So how much of the confidence that they got from Kharkov that they were able to execute the Kursk?
It was, I mean, the Kharkov operation was called Manstein's backhand blow.
Yes.
I think Kharkov changed hands more than any other major city.
Yeah, there's a fourth
it
battle of
changed hands
Kharkov
4
in the
times.
record.
Pardon me?
There's a fourth battle. There's four named battles around
Right,
Kharkov.
so it changed hands 4 times. And so when the Russians took Kharkov, first time they recovered it, which was their advance after Stalingrad, Manstein had been falling back and then counterattacked with this backhand blow, which cut off the Soviet spearheads and recaptured Kharkov, and it kind of stabilized the line. But I don't think it made the Germans feel that, okay, now we can go and, you know, head right to Moscow. I think they just said, okay, well, we can catch our breath a little bit because we've just retreated hundreds of miles after losing the whole army.
Yeah, I would suggest, though, they are still a bit arrogant. I know what you're saying, Paul, but they're used to, usually when they launch an offensive, it goes places initially. And that's why the 43 offensive at Kursk, this is not a breakthrough offensive. They're not trying to get in deeper into Russia. They're just trying to pinch off a salient.
Yeah, right.
So they have good reason to believe they can do this because they've always done it in the past, except in winter. And it doesn't.
They probably could have done it if they did it in March. You know, if they just went with what they had before the Russians could reinforce the salient, their chances of succeeding were much better than they were when they waited until July, because over time, the defense always has an advantage over the attacker. And
I agree with you, Paul, but don't forget, we'd have to check the weather because March is traditionally, March and April, very muddy. I don't know how great an offensive.
I think what Glantz says is that the Soviet generals wanted to go. I'm sorry, the German generals wanted to go. They, you know, once the operation was, you know, published, they wanted to do it as fast as possible. And they would have had a decent chance to carry it off before these belts of defense were built in such great force and depth.
Actually, I've heard some different. I heard that they were actually holding back. They were trying to say that we gotta actually catch our breath and recoup a little bit.
No, it was Hitler that was holding them back because he wanted to get the new vehicles there, the new model of tanks. And the field general said, okay, once they had it, I think they wanted to go in April. Said, if we're going to do it, let's do it now.
I was just looking at Glantz's book on the Battle of Kursk, and he's quite explicit. He thinks the Germans, it kind of made sense to wait until July, because he claims the German armored forces were at full strength. They've been refitted and the new weapons had been introduced. The problem was that the Panther and Tiger tanks had bad mechanical problems. But from the commander's point of view, it was, and many of them didn't agree. I agree they wanted to attack quickly, but Glantz says that July was a good option as well. It didn't work out. And I don't quite know, Glantz speaks in a very convoluted, writes in a very convoluted way, so I'm not entirely sure of what his real opinions are.
No,
He gave the Russians
making
2
opinions
months
on
to
this.
prepare too, so. I mean,
Okay, so we're making opinions on this. I can see Glantz's point. I would go with it because if they attack early, they're going to be attacking with Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, and they're just not as good as
Yeah.
Tigers and Panthers are supposed to be. But yes, they did have teething problems, and that messed it up.
Let me say that first of all, they did have Tigers, right? The Tiger had been started being introduced in 1942.
How many though?
Okay, they didn't have a shitload, but they had Tigers, so it wasn't as if they had nothing. And they still had the elite soldiers, and they were now concentrated, and they would be supplied. All I'm saying is that the construction of these layered defenses were what totally blunted the attack. And the Germans had always shown that they could advance tactically when they were concentrated. You know, it was always if they had sufficient concentration and weren't being pulled away for something else, they generally had success.
Correct.
This tiered defense. I mean, they had done something like that in front of Moscow, but nothing like what they did in Kursk.
Well, I just keep saying the Germans did not have the industrial capacity to compete against the USSR and the US. I mean, it's and Britain as well. It's unfortunate. For them.
Unfortunate, you think so?
For them.
You want to? Oh, okay.
Well, when you study somebody, you sort of get sympathetic with them. You always have to
Right.
resist that. I try to take a neutral view towards Hitler and trying to understand his motives. But
Can I ask a question? This is a question to Greg. You mentioned that your father was,
Grandfather.
organizing, moving
Yep.
factory to the east.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that the communist ideology, such as it was, enabled a better mobilization of the population by the Russians than in Germany, where the idea was people really didn't have total mobilization until a few years into the war?
I think it had major effect. Because the way they managed to play on the patriotic feelings with music, with like the famous songs, the slogans. I thought it was masterful job, if you want to say, because there were a lot of people who went volunteering. Besides, the Russians already had a mobilization. It's not just, they already had a drafting system to begin with, and just mobilizing people much older. Yeah, they did it very well. And in terms of organizing also, I think there was a discipline. During the war, I know my parents lived through the war as teenagers, and my grandfather actually was the first, you would say, first vice president of the plant director. So he was like number one help. He was a member of the party, and he was actually responsible for the supplies. So he was like played a major role into moving that was one of the most important plants in Kharkov, and they knew that they had to move it. Yeah.
I just have reading knowledge of, never been to Russia, but I think the ideology was still very, very strong in the population. The communists had done a wonderful job, and plus the Germans who were behaving like such beasts that the amount of rage.
Oh yeah, and the propaganda kind of telling people what's happening, because my mom as a girl, she was telling me that once they were moving, the column moving on the road with vehicles and everything, and the German airplanes coming and bombing civilians, and then also they were just running away. They were hunting people and shooting them down from the air, civilians. Not there were no army there. There was a norm. As far as discipline is concerned, is from what I heard, if you're late to work 5 minutes, that's a death sentence during the war. Also during the war, the officer can execute the soldier at any time for insubordination. So there was a lot of very harsh realities there, and people did go through a very hard time. I think because of my grandfather had such a well, actually both my grandfathers had a pretty good position, but my parents, they also went through a very hard time in terms of some level of starvation, not extreme.
Some level of what?
Starvation.
Oh.
It was like the food, you couldn't buy the food. The food was a card system that people, there was no money. You couldn't do much with money, because they were losing value. So there was a system that if you work, you receive certain amount of cards, credits, whatever you call it, to obtain the food, and it's a limited amount. And if only one person works, it's usually not enough for the whole family. So it was very, very harsh time.
Yeah, let me.
I remember my mother. She was she was married to a sailor who was in the Pacific, and I will say for Americans that if you weren't directly exposed to violence and you were working in a weapons factory, as my mother did, and you were young, it was like a 4-year party. The nervous tension was very high, but that encouraged hysteria. There was tons of drinking. It was just a lot of fun for young people. And it's just conditions in the US were so soft by comparison.
Yeah,
I think that up through Stalingrad, it was like that in Germany as well. There was euphoria after the conquest of France and so forth. And everybody, was saying, okay, this is pretty good. And then the idea was to kind of shield the civilian society from what was going on, whereas the socialist ideology was to involve all of society immediately.
Well,
everybody.
It's very interesting to compare and contrast. The communists believed in making women equal, and so they never got political power, but they were integrated deeply in the army. They got combat roles, not as rifle women, but as pilots. And they worked in the factories. Hitler was a very conservative gentleman. He did not mobilize women. He needed slave labor from the conquered territories. It was the only power that didn't put women in the factories to replace the men, even in total war.
Just think of the fact that, as the butt of jokes in every parody of Russians, the fact that Russian party members would address each other as comrade, right? Comrade is the general to the private, comrade general, comrade private. But the notion of comrade coming first is something that's intrinsic to the socialist ideology, the communist ideology, as untrue as it may have been, but it's still you know, it's complicated. Both things are happening at the same time. People are cynical, people are hurting, but people are still wanting to believe in things like that, which call on real human qualities.
I read on Stalin made the decision to bring back officer insignia and all the brass, and that there wasn't a factory that could produce it in the Soviet Union, so they imported it from the U.S.
Well,
Right.
Yeah, they did change during the war.
Yeah, they-
Different. At the end of the war, there was completely different, way identifying the ranks than at the beginning of the war. That's interesting. But I wanted to say one thing. Those people who still love Stalin, they say this thing, and it is actually true. It's just a point of view, so you understand. They think about Stalin like this. He got the country in ruins and he built it into the superpower and won the war. I mean, and it is kind of true. So you see where these people coming from. It's like a national pride, and things. I mean, so that's why the loss of the superpower status is a huge blow to the national ego, and that's why Russia
Yeah,
is now
I-
revived and so aggressive.
But no, it's very sad. The Soviet Union did beat the best army in history. It's very sad indeed that it turned out the way it did. Because if you look at it, the Soviets built their own tanks, but they were driving around in American Jeeps and trucks. They knew the word Studebaker at the time. It was rather sad. The Americans supplied the equipment and the Soviets supplied the blood in defeating Nazi Germany, because Eisenhower in the West was very careful of his soldiers' lives. That's why he became president. He was so popular. My father worshipped Eisenhower, even though Eisenhower was a Republican. I come from a deeply Democratic family. MacArthur was the other general, and everybody, all his subordinates hated him. He didn't stand a chance of getting elected. But the reason Eisenhower, he had a slow strategy in the West. He always tried to keep all the Allied forces moved at the same pace, very slowly. People didn't expose themselves, and so soldiers have a way of appreciating that. Stalin, the Soviet approach was very different. You just had, and it may have been the only realistic one. How do you conquer Berlin except by sending in narrow, focused assault forces, willing to take extraordinarily high casualties?
I also
Could the
wanted to-
Americans have beaten the Germans on their own? I doubt it. Culturally, we wouldn't tolerate the necessary casualties. It's a
But I would
democracy.
suggest, I don't think Stalin could have beaten the Germans on the Russians couldn't have done it either. It was an allied effort. We needed
Yeah,
both.
it's
sides. We supplied the
true.
economy.
Without American equipment, it would have been difficult.
Yes.
Right, but not necessarily without American Second Front. By that time, it was already kind of going the other way. But yes, equipment saved a lot of lives and helped.
Yeah, this is, I'm glad you brought that up, Greg, because it's really, for me personally, it's annoying to constantly hear about the Stalin needed a second front. The only nation in the world that wasn't fighting on two fronts was the Soviet Union. And when he says there was no second front, the Atlantic was a second front. The Pacific was a second front. They don't get Lend-Lease without the Allies keeping those oceans open. And the strategic bombing campaign of Germany, that's a second front. You know, millions, thousands of German civilians are being killed and their war industry is being hurt. So Stalin, you know, this is, to my mind, one of the myths of the war. He had more than two. We were fighting all over the place. We were fighting in Africa. We were fighting in Alaska. Stalin is only fighting on the Eastern Front.
Joe,
I
actually,
think he was focused on casualties.
If I may say one thing, I understand all that. I agree. I grew up in Russia, and I, just to give you a little bit of a Russian experience, obviously, clearly, I was born way after the war. However, my parents were teenagers, and my grandparents were involved, and it is entirely different experience when the country is being invaded, where rather than sending troops abroad. So the rage that it creates, the ripple effect. I mean, I'm not even saying that probably every family in Russia had someone dead during the war fighting Germans. They also had someone dead in Gulag as well. I mean, it's another addition to it. Almost every family is affected in such way. I mean, certainly my family in both ways were affected. And growing up, like almost a generation after the war, the wound was so deep that that I totally got that experience. I mean, not the first hand, but because of the experience of the whole society, it was so deep, so much embellished. Yeah, I may come up sometimes because I grew up through this that the Russians did it single-handedly and all this stuff. I understand it's not true, and I may have been affected by that by growing up. I try to take a more kind of realistic understanding, but keep in mind that the whole nation was so enraged. I mean, if you could think of Pearl Harbor, how it enraged American nation, compare this to being invaded, physically invaded, and having, tens of millions of people, civilians, die from it.
Well, in the Pacific, there was the racial component. The Japanese behaved abominably, but it sort of caused the Americans to behave not so well either. The Pacific War was very unfortunate. I will say in the U.S., I'm from New England. I can't speak for the rest of the country, but the World War II was always a war mostly against Japan. There was very little anger felt against the Germans. We had a general named Eisenhower. The Germans were too well integrated in the U.S. society for there to be too much anger. But against the Japanese, all bets were off, and that there were a lot of factors for that. One was Pearl Harbor. The other one that the Japanese wouldn't quit. They would keep fighting until literally the last man, except for one or two, and that enraged Americans because Americans were dying as well. Which that has a lot to do with the atom bomb being dropped with the two of them, because there was a picture published in every newspaper in the country of a Japanese officer beheading an American POW in the week before Hiroshima, and that sort of thing annoys people. So World War II was the most uncivilized war. I mean, it's funny how the earlier wars, the violence is softened because the weapons are more primitive, and 30 Years' War was really unpleasant, but the 20th century wars come across as so much worse in some way. But
yeah, it's tough when you make those, and I know you're not really making a comparison, but any war fought seriously is going to be extremely violent. We don't even talk about the Taiping Rebellion, which took place in China. Yeah. At the same time as we're fighting our civil war. In our civil war, we lost 700,000 people. We consider that monstrous. 20 million Chinese died in the 1860s. They didn't have nuclear weapons. They didn't have bombs. They just slaughtered. I mean, wars are always bad. One of the nations that we consider great, or civilizations we consider great, is Rome. And Rome was beastly in its early days. I mean, they were just wiping out populations. If they didn't like the city, that city would disappear. The Mongols would do the same thing. Both specifically the Romans, they're thought highly of. Roman civilization is usually considered one of the great civilizations of the world, as it should be. And the Mongols, for whatever reason, they've become more popular recently. There's all sorts of books being written about how the Mongols basically spread civilization throughout the world after they slaughtered everybody who got in their way. So, wars are always like that. Specifically World War II, there's no nation that's clean. We don't come close to what the Germans and the Nazis did. Excuse me, the Germans and the Japanese did. But boy, you look at some of the things that were done by Americans, they're not good. We were slaughtering people too, just not on that level. And if you look at the strategic bombing campaign, 67, I think I might have that number wrong, but at least 60 cities in Japan were incinerated. Basically incinerated. That's a war crime. What we did before the war, we signed this protocol or whatever, saying that unrestricted submarine warfare was bad. How did we beat Japan? Unrestricted submarine warfare. We did it all the time. That island was starving. Hiroshima could be considered a positive thing because it prevented the Japanese from just starving themselves to death because they had no food. So
Well, I think I would just respond, yes, there's an order of magnitude difference between what the Americans sunk to and what the Japanese sunk to. But when you think about what an invasion of Japan would have been like,
I agree.
they would have mobilized the entire population, and they were calculating it was Operation Olympic, I think. They were calculating 250,000 American deaths and millions of Japanese deaths.
No, I'm all
But-
for having dropped the nuclear weapon. I'm just saying every nation in that war behaved badly. You know, there's no nation that possibly the Danes for whatever I heard the Danes actually, but I think even they supplied some troops to the voluntary troops to the some SS unit, small one. But every nation, that's just the way of war. You know, even in the Japanese prison camps, which we so, you know, monstrous. Most of the people serving in those camps were not Japanese. You know, they were using Koreans. They were using captured people to run those camps. So no nation is clean. That's my argument.
Well, no state establishes itself without violence. I can't think of an exception to that. It's just the way it is.
Yep.
No organized state. I can't. Usually, you become big by conquering other people. You always become big by conquering other people. It's unfortunate, but
Yeah, what happened to the generals, you know, Meinstein and Guderian after the Kursk?
gee.
I remember Meinstein was given to Russians because he gave himself to Western Front, and then they gave him, I mean, to Americans. He gave himself up to Americans, and then they handed it over to Russians and they executed him.
Manstein was
he wrote a
sacked
memoir,
by Hitler.
Manstein.
Huh?
Manstein was sacked by Hitler after
Yeah.
Kursk
He was
because he
sacked.
was continuing to ask for permission to retreat. And at a certain point, Hitler had enough, and he said, "Okay, you're gone."
I was thinking about after war. I mean, it's interesting always what happened.
I know Manstein wrote a memoir. I don't know if he
Lost
got
victories.
I don't know their biographies very well. I don't know if he got a job with NATO or something. Some of those Nazi generals did get. Hans Speidel, who was Rommel's chief of staff, he ended up as a NATO general. With the West Germans. I think Manstein was clean enough. I don't think he was implicated in. You have to. I admit I don't know I'm not a specialist in World War II. I don't.
John, you're right in terms of immediately after the war, but it's since come out that he knew some of those orders that were requiring Russian civilians to be killed, and he abided by them.
That's another issue. It's just, the Wehrmacht were enthusiastic and voluntary supporters of war atrocities against the Jews and the Slavs. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think Manstein was dirty enough to be caught up in that. I could be wrong, but
I mean, there was this whole thing. I mean, one of the reasons they created those, killing machines and the gas is because initially they were shooting the Jews and the Slavs. You know, the soldiers were getting psychological issues.
Yes.
Right?
You're absolutely right, Zach.
one of the most amazing statements of the war is that speech Himmler gave, where he said it was to an SS group, and he said it's great how you can experience such dreadful things and you still remain decent people, which it's just bizarre. But that's how Himmler felt. It's just that, and that's why they did switch to more industrial methods of execution.
Right.
With shooting people, the blood gets all over you. And even Himmler, who was visiting a camp, he had some blood splattered on himself, as I recall. And so the human personality is very strange.
There's a real interesting study called The Nazi Doctors, of the psychological study of the staff of the concentration camps. And they said that except for a few sociopathic individuals like Joseph Mengele, the whole rest of the staff was drunk all the time.
Yeah,
that was the only way they could possibly get through their day.
Well, that's always been
Even Joseph Mengele, didn't he have like 15 pharmacies in Argentina and eventually ended up owning a farm somewhere in Chile and dying his own? I mean, he comparably became, was a normal human being after the war. What had, why he was psychotic at that time? I don't
didn't
know.
say psychotic. I said he was sociopathic. He felt no guilt. He had no problems with what he was doing. He enjoyed it.
I'm sure that there is a lot of sick people that are like that.
Doesn't mean he's psychotic.
Right.
Well, this is a very interesting.
We have drifted far from the subject matter, but that's okay.
Always like that.
Yeah. Well, any other questions you guys have, or let me see, what is it? Oh, we have 30 more minutes. So now after the Kursk, what is the next battle that was, so to speak, decisive, not decisive, but at least major battle that
Did you already do Stalingrad?
we did Stalingrad?
Yeah,
No, but I'm just talking in general. We're not.
Okay, let me suggest the next major thing will be 1944 Operation Bagration, which I probably mispronounced, where the Soviets basically eliminate Army Group Center.
How you call
said
it?
it again?
It was a Russian general
Bagration,
during the
Bagration,
Napoleonic Wars, Bagration or Bagration.
Oh yeah. In Russian it's called Bagration.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's also Napoleonic general during the Napoleon offensive, like Kutuzov, Operation Kutuzov. That was Bagration. Yeah.
So I guess next week. Go ahead, Paul.
After Kursk, though, it's just very monotonous. The pattern just repeats itself and repeats itself and repeats itself. There's no longer any question of what the outcome is going to be.
Well, there are moments, though, Paul. I know what you're saying, but the Hungarian offensive was successful for a short period of time. I mean, they do have their, short.
Right. They have the little burst, but
yes.
Then the steamroller keeps rolling.
Yes.
I wouldn't mind hearing about side issues, if I can call them that, something like the Home Army uprising in Warsaw, and not the
I was just
the
thinking
ghetto
about that.
uprising, but the one in 44. That's little known in
Right.
the West, and I have a book on the subject, but I've never gotten around to reading it.
Yeah,
It'd be nice to-
it's very interesting what happened there, because the Russians came to the the Wisla River.
The Vistula just sat there.
Vistula, yeah, and they just sat there because there was two resistance groups in Warsaw. It was called Armia Krajova and Armia Ludova, which is army of people or army of the country. And one of them was pro-Soviet, the other one was pro-Western, and it is the one that pro-Western one that organized the uprising in the hope that the Russians will use that to attack Warsaw, but the Stalin wanted that resistance eliminated, so the other resistance group could get a control later on. So he supposedly delayed, but they said that they're not ready. Eventually, what happened is that the Germans managed, by the way, to put all kinds of explosives all over the city. They annihilated the city before they left. They completely destroyed. Warsaw was rebuilt from the scratch.
Is it true that the leaders of the Western faction among Poles had been living in England and were flown into Poland like just right before this uprising? So the Russians felt that the British had pulled a fast one on them.
Right.
Flown these anti-communist guys, because these are hardcore anti-communists.
It's true, but everybody had to join. Once the uprising started, and the Germans started to kill everybody, everybody had to join, and then the Russians really let the Germans completely annihilate all the resistance. I mean, maybe not all, but a lot of it, and before they moved in. So it was kind of that. The Polish people considered it a great betrayal. So that's. That's very, very unfortunate event that happened there, a big problem that was probably part of the
I mean,
Russian-Polish
just
agreement.
remember that these, you know, these anti-communists in Poland, this dates back to the Red Army's attempt to invade Poland in 1920,
Sure.
right? And so this is not just, you know, you know, like an American conservative. These were people who saw this as life and death, were really hardcore anti-communists, and
But then also you
one
remember
could
the
say to
story
the-
of Katyn, right?
why should the Soviets sacrifice their men in order to allow a government to be formed by these people who are their bitter enemies, who were brought in under their noses at the last minute?
I know, but at the same time, there were so many innocent people being killed, and they
Sure,
just
sure.
stand
But who
and
killed
watch
them?
it.
Was it
You know,
the
so I
Russians
think,
or the British who put
Uh,
them in jeopardy with like that?
well, but the Russians could have supported this uprising.
Sure, they
They
could.
they did it on purpose. That's how I see it. You
Well,
know, and
I'm saying
it
it was
was
a British
very,
adventure. You know, it was
yeah,
a British adventure that kind of started the incident.
right. No, yeah. So, you know, there are different points of view, and I personally think that they should have attacked and taken the city during the uprising, because they probably, once they occupied the city, they probably also had a lot of influence there, and they could have put their own people anyway. No, I think yeah, they, if they would have supported uprising, they would have to occupy the city anyway. No, then
Right.
they would control. You know, so I think it was a little bit malicious, you know, in the way they let people die.
Sure.
So and you know, I am I'm kind of Russian. You know, I have a Russian background. I grew up there. So but I even when in Russia and I started this, I thought it was you know, like you have to be aware of you know, every country commits all kinds of horrible things. You know, so this is one of them. You know, a lot of Russians could have argued, like using your argument or any other, but I think that was very bad what they did, and certainly there's plenty of bad blood between Russians and Polish. I'm not even talking about that the Russian soldiers, the way they behaved in a foreign territory was atrocious, you know, and of course it was suppressed in Russia, but it was horrible. In Poland, in particular, you know, every Polish woman practically was raped. You know, that's
I did not know.
I
I did not know that. I was thought it was strictly Germans.
no. Right, when the Russians took over, they were behaving horrible. I mean, it's in literature, it's in many sources, and you know, I've been to Poland, and everybody is aware of this. It was very bad. You know,
So Greg, let me ask you another question. It's related. So 1943, there's a Jewish uprising. Did the Polish make a mistake in not supporting the Jewish uprising? Because they're going to do the same thing a year later and get slaughtered by themselves.
well, listen, the Poles are probably the biggest anti-Semites
Fully
ever
understand.
existed.
Fully
So,
understand.
so I don't think they made a mistake, because they would have been slaughtered along with Jews. While the Russian army is a little bit different, they had an advantage. They would have won this. You know, if Polish would supported the ghetto Jewish ghetto uprising, you know, they had no chance of winning it. It would be just, you know. Besides, you know, but I think it would be great. It would be a heroic act, but they had no chance to win, while Russians had many chances to win if they would have supported. It would be easier for them to take the city while there was a ongoing uprising going on. You know, it's a little bit different.
There was
Okay,
a
thank you.
famous when Jews were coming back to Poland after the war, the Polish, people were, in fact, there was a slaughter was going on to Jews after the World War II. and it was well documented. I think there was a documentary about it as well. No,
But I
Greg.
think the main thing is that they didn't support it, not just because they're anti-Semite. They didn't support it because they knew that they had no chance, you know. And that's why they let. Of course, I mean, I'm also a Jew, so from my Jewish point of view, it seems to be unfair, you know. But I have to be realistic about this. But it's very interesting what happened.
All right. So, John, I have a question. Interesting.
Yes.
So, all this assessment that Hitler, have you done any kind of, analytics of war or economy of war before, basically trying to invade Soviet Union? And he had that famous pact, Ribbentrop, Molotov pact, and he didn't need to invade Soviet Union. I mean, obviously, there was a threat going forth, and there's a lot of hearsay, and everybody was preparing from both sides, but have you ever done any kind of like calculation, just an accounting of the war?
No, I've been reading a biography of Talleyrand, Talleyrand, the
Yeah,
French
the
foreign
French,
minister under
yeah.
Napoleon, and
Right.
reading Napoleon was a lot like Hitler. Napoleon just didn't believe in balance of power, having faithful allies. He just wanted to conquer everything in sight. And he ended up having all the powers of Europe opposed to him. And Hitler followed the same route. He didn't really, his allies were kind of a joke in terms of helping him, Italy or Hungary or Romania. But he invaded somebody. There's no evidence that Stalin, despite what people say, there's no evidence that Stalin would have invaded Nazi Germany, as far as I know. But Hitler just had this death wish of some sort. He thought he could get away with attacking, invading people who together in the aggregate were much stronger than him. I don't think he calculated much of anything. In terms of like Talleyrand, the traditional diplomat who was just interested in maintaining the peace of the continent. So he wanted to balance powers against each other. I mean, you had to be Talleyrand thought the French should be nice to Austria because Austria was a good buffer state between Russia and France. And Napoleon felt differently. And I think Hitler was very much the same type, the will to dominance. And it's irrational, and it ended up very, very badly for both of them.
Right. Initially you would think that Hitler, and we'll have it next week, a discussion, but when he took over Sudetenland and even before invading Poland, he seemed to play the game really well. He was aggressive, but was playing the game really well.
Yeah, he did everything right. I think the person of firm, solid opinions, tends to carry the day against doubtful people with weaker opinions. And it eventually caught up with him, though. Of course, Hitler had the big racist component. Somebody like Napoleon did not. Actually, Napoleon's record on the Jews is very good indeed.
Not so good on the
He's
blacks.
still
but go
admired
ahead.
by the Jews. Liberated every ghetto he conquered. But he also caused the deaths.
Napoleon had a famous release from the Roman Catholic Church of the Inquisition letters that miraculously only two carriages were saved and the rest was destroyed. He asked Pope to release the Inquisition letters from the when it was conducted and stuff. Like 400 years ago. So.
People have very mixed feelings about Napoleon. He's greatly admired in France still, even though he caused the deaths of many millions of people. And he was a total disaster for Europe, certainly, and for France, but very similar to Hitler. And
he brought a lot of glory.
Yeah, he wanted glory and he wanted dominance. He wasn't interested in alliances, which he would have, had a much more successful career.
Right.
Yeah.
No one in their right mind right now would come out and say, I'm a follower of Hitler, right? And obviously that's, but people are saying that, about Stalin, and Russia right now is crazy.
It is very odd.
No, Zach, you're being very kind because there are some Americans who are followers of Hitler right now, but.
Well, there was not in polite society. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
But it is true that the Putin regime has really emphasized the World War II experience as sort of a binder of Russian patriotism in support of them. So I think that has something to do with the rehabilitation of Stalin. Because the Putin got very upset with that reporter who doubted the fact that that battle was a great victory. So
Putin himself is an admirer of Stalin. That's basically it. He's an authoritarian. I mean, it's you know.
Died a natural death. That's unusual for dictators. So.
Well, there are some speculations that he was poisoned.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure there are. By the way, there's a great movie, The Death of Stalin.
Yeah,
If you
sure.
haven't seen it, see it. It's
On Netflix, right?
Of
it takes a very dark episode and makes it into a very dark comedy. It's hilarious. So.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So just to reiterate, this was the largest tank battle ever, right? The Kursk battle.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
so there's been some new scholarship, just to let you know. It's been suggested that a place called Dulno or something in 1941 was a larger tank battle.
Oh.
Tanks aren't as good, but there are many more of them. That's the new scholarship that's come out.
Okay.
Dubno, D-O-B-N-O.
I've heard of the place,
Oh,
but it's pretty clear
Just
that
remember,
the
those are
Soviets really
Pretty
pushed.
lousy tanks, but they are tanks.
The Soviets applied the propaganda to Kursk to make it. But it is odd that Kursk is so little known outside of Russia. I mean, there are lots of movies about, well, at least two movies about Stalingrad, a German and an American one, Enemy at the Gates. And there's a Russian movie about Kursk, but there's no non-Russian movie about Kursk, which is odd. And I just saw Enemy at the Gates is totally fiction. It's about a sniper duel in Stalingrad, and
but there was a sniper duel there.
not between two individuals.
Yeah,
They went out. They had sniper forces that would go out and shoot each other.
Right.
But the idea of one-to-one duel did not happen, and Zaitsev was not even the highest scoring sniper.
Right.
It was just in a unit that was favored by the commanding general. Shwikov was his name.
Shwikov, yeah.
I was just reading about this. Zaitsev was a very good sniper, but he wasn't number one.
Yeah, but for dramatization, I mean, it was a pretty good movie. I have.
Oh yeah, it was. I thought Bob Hoskins' Khrushchev was marvelous. He did it so well.
Very good.
It was just like, yeah, I mean, it was great. So next week we're doing the where Hitler went wrong in Russian campaign, and we kind of a little bit discussed about it. So, and I guess the format will be the same with a lot of discussions. Tomorrow we have the history of money or FX. It's me, James, and Aaron presenting. I'm going to talk about history of money, and then James is going to talk about history of FX, and particularly about Nixon, kind of creating that whole thing, and also and Aaron is going to talk about blockchain, which is people are interested about blockchain. So he told me not to talk about Bitcoin, so I won't say anything about Bitcoin. Yeah, I mean, that's probably gonna be 3 hour, 2.5 hour presentation, because there's 3 of us. So, and we have over 35 people sign up tomorrow. I don't know how many is gonna show up.
Okay. Good.
Well, these evening things, I get pushed back. It's in the middle of our dinner hours, so people are not totally pleased. So
I'm sorry. Yeah. Well,
That's the only time really realistic.
Yeah.
For a meeting. Yeah.
Well, I'm retired. I like it earlier at 6, but I assume people had jobs. So
I mean, we could do 6:30 at some point, especially on this stuff. Maybe we can compromise on 6:30 or something like that. I mean,
Sure, I'm fine with 6:30.
Yeah,
I'm also retired.
6:30 would be better.
Okay, I will change it to 6:30, except the one on the 16th, which is going to be Jonathan is going to talk about the King John,
Yeah.
brother of Richard the Lionheart, and
I
Paul.
want to see that guy rehabilitated. I mean, he deserves better than
John
history.
Lackland. They call
John
him
Lackland.
Lackland.
Anybody who has such a bad reputation, he must, there must be something good about him.
Well, look, you could Magna Carta happened during his reign, so because of his weakness, but it's actually you could see it as a positive thing,
He
right?
didn't support it, but yes, it did happen during his reign.
Right, so you could see it as a positive development. But then also
Richard
he
is-
lost all the English lands in France. I mean, like.
But his brother Richard
Yeah,
hardly spent any time in England at all.
right.
It's an open question whether he even spoke English, and he's the great English hero. I mean, I never understood it.
Well, he did.
He was a French king.
Yeah,
Romantic, romantic.
Hey, listen, English always, had that eye on the French crown, so it always was the case. So that's why
He was a big,
Was
a
he
great
very
general.
popular before Sir Walter Scott?
That's a good question. That's very
I
interesting.
would think so. But he was during the Crusades. I mean, he was a
Yes,
a
but as
pretty
they
good
say,
general. I
he
mean,
was not very, he had almost no connection to Britain in his actual lifetime.
Yeah, it's
right.
true.
He was
I
always
remember,
fighting the wars. He was
I remember
fighting wars, and then he was held hostage.
Richard was a person that horrified Arabs. I mean, generations of Arab children would be told if they didn't behave, he'd give them to Ricky Melech, Ricky the King, which he
Yeah.
did have charisma.
Absolutely.
And it
I mean,
affected both sides. The Arabs were very impressed with him.
yeah.
as opposed to Barbarossa, who just basically, drowned somewhere before reaching the Holy Land.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
he was already old guy by the time.
No, the thing, you've already done the Crusades to death, I imagine, but the
Right.
amazing
That
thing,
was not yeah. That
the
was not,
first crusade was a huge success against all odds, and everything after that was a disaster for the West. So
I'd really like to see someone do some research and present on Frederick II, Frederick Hohenstaufen.
yeah, the one who knew Arabic and
The
was
one who knew Arabic,
Right,
the one
right.
who was excommunicated, the one who
Yeah.
negotiated successfully with
that's
the
a good
Arabs.
idea.
and
Yeah, he
gathered
actually-
the
grew up in Sicily, right?
Yes, in Sicily and in
that's what-
southern Italy.
He did
Yeah,
speak
yeah.
Arabic well.
And he wrote a book on
Yes.
falconry
Yes,
and was this tremendous thorn in the side of the Pope. Seemingly from a, kind of a rationalistic point of view. The story was that once an emissary came from the papal court and he put the guy in a barrel of wine and put the lid on it, drowned him to death, and they sat around waiting to see his spirit rising up.
well, he did massacre 3,000 prisoners at Acre. That's what he's most infamous for. So, I'm thinking of King Richard.
He was a darling of the left at some point.
Really?
It's better to drown in wine than in water. I mean, I have to say.
Whoa, what's
It's
the-
easier. I mean, you could get so drunk that you wouldn't even realize.
Oh my God.
Anyway.
Greg, you got some jokes. What's the difference? You're dying, no matter where you.
Well, I'm talking about it's easier. It's easier,
Oh, okay.
you know? At
Yeah, I
least,
think what he's saying is if you have to go,
Right.
Yeah, but
Greg, you're a very positive person.
yeah, I mean, I'll put it on the schedule for Frederick. I'll if anybody wants to step
He's
up.
an interesting figure. No,
Very
I've read a
colorful.
fair amount about him. I'm not volunteering, but
Very colorful guy.
Okay, I mean, I'll put it on the schedule. I'll say need presenter, and then whoever's.
yeah.
And need
That's
researcher.
I'm not pointing fingers, but I mean, Jonathan's probably gonna do somewhere on Crusades something too. We only did Teutonic Knights, but
Yeah, but
there's plenty of others.
yeah, we can put this alone, but we're also still going through our main line. We're still in Greeks, and then we'll go to Romans. That's another strip.
And we haven't touched Egypt yet, which we're not gonna touch probably until 2022 anyway.
All right, Egypt is like its own story. I mean, we could address it at some point separately, I think.
All right.
Well, Akhenaten would be a great topic. I mean, the monotheistic
Sure.
pharaoh.
Yeah, if anybody wants to do like an presentation on any kind of anything, out of progression, sure, we have time for that too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could put the whole schedule in. We're not gonna put it on Meetup, but just put it in there and kind of hanging and
Yeah,
change
well,
things anyway. Because we had a Zionist state spilled over, so we're gonna do Zionism, in a couple of weeks. And Pearl Harbor spilled over, so we're doing, Pearl Harbor now. So sometimes it extends to next week or whatever.
yes, yeah.
All right. I want to wish everybody a nice evening. I hopefully see some of you or all of you tomorrow. If
Sure.
not, see you on Sunday for Pearl Harbor, guys.
Are we
night.
finally going to get to Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
Well, I don't promise.
We'll see. We'll see.
Good night, everybody.
I can't promise. I'll see.
Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it.
Aaron is great on the build-up.
All right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's all foreplay so far.
Exactly.
Okay. All
Exactly.
right.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thanks,
night.
everybody.
Likewise.
Yeah, good night.